The rain had started as a gentle whisper against the windshield, a soothing soundtrack for Jenna's late-night drive through the winding backroads of Northern Oregon. She'd rented a secluded cabin for the weekend, hoping the isolation and endless forest would untangle the stress of her job in Portland. When she finally pulled into the gravel driveway of Ashwood Cabin, the rhythmic patter on the roof felt almost hypnotic. The cabin looked quaint and inviting, its porch light casting a warm glow on the surrounding pines. Yet something about the dense, shifting shadows between the trees seemed heavier than just a stormy night. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Jenna dropped her overnight bag on the couch, lit the fireplace, and opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving. The rain intensified, turning from a whisper to a soft drumming against the wooden walls. She found herself listening intently, as though the rain carried a subtle melody, one that rose and fell, sometimes almost human in its cadence. Laughing at her own imagination, she settled into an armchair by the fire and let the flickering flames lull her into a sense of peace. Around midnight, a single, deliberate knock echoed from the front door. It wasn't the creak of wood or a branch striking the siding. It was a sharp, measured sound, utterly distinct from the rain. Jenna froze, her glass of wine halfway to her lips. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and the only neighbor was a closed-up summer home 2 miles down the road. Slowly, she stood, her pulse thudding in her ears, and approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness and the sheen of rain pooling on the pea. She waited, holding her breath, convinced she had imagined it. But the knock came again, 3 evenly spaced raps, firm but not aggressive. "Hello," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The rain seemed louder now, masking any distant noises that might give her clues. No reply came, no movement outside, only the persistent sound of water rushing through the gutters. Jenna's hand hovered over the deadbolt, debating whether to open the door, when a third knock rattled the wood, this time closer to the ground, as if someone were crouching. Jenna backed away and grabbed her phone, only to see that there was no signal. She flicked on the porch light again, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging the porch into darkness. The only illumination came from the firelight behind her and the dim reflection of rain streaking down the window panes. Somewhere outside, between the rustling trees and the relentless rain, something shifted. The forest had swallowed the sound whole, leaving Jenna staring at the door, a hollow unease settling deep in her chest. Morning came gray and heavy, the storm still murmuring over the hills. Julia woke with her heart still uneasy, unsure whether the night's events had been real or the tricks of exhaustion and rain. The attic was colder than usual, her breath misting faintly in the air. She hesitated before glancing toward the window, half expecting to see a shape waiting outside. But it was only the rain, thinner now, sliding down the glass in trembling streaks. When she finally stood, she noticed small marks on the sill, thin trails of mud, as if something or someone had leaned there during the night. Her stomach tightened, but she said nothing. Maybe it was just runoff from the storm. Maybe. Downstairs, Mrs. Lark was already in the kitchen, humming to herself over a pot of tea. She was in her late 70s, with bright eyes that always seemed to be studying you. "Did the storm keep you up?" she asked, setting down a chipped mug. Julia hesitated before nodding. "I thought I heard something on the roof," she admitted. The old woman chuckled softly, stirring her tea. "You'll hear all sorts of things in this house. It's got its moods. Some nights, I swear it sighs." Julia smiled politely, Though the words lingered in her mind like a draft, as she left the kitchen, something on the hallway wall caught her eye, an old black and white photograph in a tarnished frame. She could have sworn it hadn't been there the day before. It showed the house as it might have looked decades earlier. The same steep roof, the same winding porch, but in the foreground stood a family of four. Their faces were blurred from age, except for one detail Julia couldn't unsee. A tall figure at the edge of the frame, half in shadow, standing near the upstairs window. The attic window. Her window. The man's face was indistinct, but his outline, long coat, tilted head, looked eerily familiar. A chill ran through her as she traced the photograph's edge. "Mrs. Lark?" she called. "Who's in this picture?" The old woman appeared behind her silently, as though she'd been waiting. You noticed that," she said, her tone unreadable. "That's the family who built this house, the Marins. That's their son, Thomas, there by the window. Poor boy vanished one night in a storm not unlike the one we had last evening. Never found a trace. The police said he must have run off, but his mother swore she heard him tapping on the glass for days after." Julia's mouth went dry. "And the photo?" she asked. "I don't remember it being here before." Mrs. Lark smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what this house decides to show you, dear." Julia returned to her attic that afternoon, unable to shake the story. She set her laptop aside and stood before the window again. The rain had almost stopped, though the sky was still bruised with clouds. She pressed her fingers to the glass where she'd seen the handprint last night. It was cold, unnaturally so. She looked down at the sill again and noticed something she hadn't before. Not just mud, but faint scratches in the wood, like fingernail marks. A sound behind her made her spin, just the creak of the floorboards. She exhaled, laughing softly at herself. But then she saw it, reflected in the glass, a figure standing in the doorway behind her. When she turned, the space was empty. The air smelled faintly of wet earth. That night, the storm gathered with new force, rattling the shutters and sending long, hollow groans through the old timbers of the hotel. Clara lay in bed with the silver key in her hand, its surface catching the flicker of the firelight. She had turned it over countless times since finding the locked corridor, tracing the worn grooves, feeling the slight bend in its stem. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in her room. In fact, it didn't look like it belonged to this century at all. She knew she shouldn't test it. Madame Varenne's voice still lingered in her mind, but curiosity, once planted, was harder to put to bed than any restless thought. She waited until the hall outside her room was silent, the only sounds the rain and the slow creak of the building settling. Pulling on her coat, she stepped into the dim corridor, the oil lamps casting long shadows that seemed to sway as she moved. The hotel at night felt different, the air heavier, the silence deeper. She kept her steps light, listening for any sign of movement as she made her way toward the locked wing. The tall arched windows were dark mirrors now, reflecting her lone figure as she passed. When she reached the ornate door, her fingers hesitated on the cold, iron keyhole. The faint breathing she had heard earlier was still there, though quieter, as if whoever, or whatever, lay beyond had fallen into an even deeper slumber. The silver key slid into place with an ease that startled her, as though it had been waiting for her hand. She turned it slowly. A click echoed down the corridor, sharp in the stillness, and the door gave way with a soft sigh. Inside was a narrow chamber lit only by a single candle on a low table. The walls were bare stone, damp and cool to the touch. Against the far wall stood a simple bed, and on it, someone lay sleeping beneath a thin white sheet. Their face was turned away, hair dark against the pillow. Clara took one step closer and froze. The air in the room had changed. A smell of lavender, stronger now, mixed with something metallic, faint but unmistakable. She reached for the candle, but before her fingers touched it, the figure on the bed exhaled slowly and whispered her name. Clara stumbled back, heart pounding, slamming the door shut and twisting the key free. She didn't stop moving until she was back in her room. The key dropped carelessly onto the desk. Her breathing slowed, but sleep did not come willingly. When it did, it came all at once, heavy as lead. In her dream, she stood in that same stone room, but the bed was empty. The walls pulsed faintly as if alive, and words began to crawl across them in looping script. "You are not the first." She woke with a gasp just before dawn, the taste of lavender still on her tongue. By morning, the storm had slackened to a steady drizzle, but the air was still heavy and damp, clinging to the skin like a second layer. Clara dressed quickly, her mind still tangled in the fragments of the night before. The silver key sat exactly where she had dropped it on the desk, its dull sheen somehow more noticeable in daylight. She slipped it into her coat pocket without thinking, feeling its weight with every step as she descended to the common room. The fire was burning again, though the room was less crowded than usual. Only 3 guests were seated in the plush chairs, their gazes unfocused, eyes half-lidded as if they were still shaking off the last layers of sleep. In the far corner, by a window clouded with condensation, sat a man Clara had not seen before. His suit was outdated but well kept, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose. He wasn't reading or watching the fire. He was watching her. When she finally crossed the room and offered a tentative good morning, he gestured to the empty seat beside him. His voice, when he spoke, was low but precise, each word deliberate. "You went into the East Wing last night." Clara froze mid-step. He smiled faintly, though it did not feel friendly. "It's always the new guests who find their way there. The old ones have learned better." She sat slowly, heart thudding in her chest. "What's in that room?" she asked. The man glanced toward the others in the room, then leaned closer. "Not what? Who?" He introduced himself as Mr. Bellamy and spoke in a tone that made her feel as though the two of them were already being overheard. "The sleepers in this place," he murmured. "They don't dream the way you think. The hotel? Here it's what they see, what they remember." He tapped the side of his temple with one finger. "It keeps the good ones fed, the bad ones locked away. But sometimes a dream slips through." Clara wanted to press for more, but his eyes flicked over her shoulder and his voice went flat. "Madame Varenne is watching." When she turned, the woman stood near the doorway, her pale gaze calm but unblinking. After that, Mr. Bellamy did not speak again. He simply rose, nodded once, and left by a side hall. Clara sat there for several minutes, staring into her untouched cup of tea. The thought of drinking it made her uneasy now. She felt as though she had just been handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half hidden on purpose. Outside, the drizzle thickened again, the sound mingling with the crackle of the fire until it was hard to tell which belonged to the world outside and which to the walls themselves. Julia didn't sleep that night. She sat wrapped in her blanket, staring at the floor until dawn. The voice had stopped after that last, chilling warning, "Don't let him in." But she couldn't unhear it. The way it echoed, muffled yet desperate, still vibrated in her bones. When sunlight finally crept through the attic window, it felt weaker than usual, gray and reluctant. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet wood and rust. Somewhere beneath the boards, she could still sense a kind of quiet pulse, as if the house itself was breathing. By mid-morning, Julia's fear had shifted into determination. She needed to know what was under there. She pulled the rug aside and knelt on the creaking floor, tapping along the planks one by one. Most sounded solid, dull, heavy, but near the center of the room, just beside the old desk, came a hollow thud. She tapped again. Same sound. Kneeling closer, She ran her fingers along the seams between boards and found a thin line of dust that didn't match the others, a faint outline of something rectangular. Her heart began to race. It was a hatch, a trapdoor, hidden under years of neglect. She fetched a screwdriver from her suitcase and worked the edge of the wood, the metal scraping softly. The smell of old earth rose up as the board gave way. Beneath the loose plank lay a small, iron latch, corroded with age. Julia hesitated, half expecting to hear the voice again. But there was only the rain and her own shallow breathing. She lifted the latch. The door opened with a groan, releasing a rush of cold, damp air that smelled of soil and something else, something faintly metallic. She shone her flashlight into the darkness. Below was a narrow staircase descending into blackness. Her hands trembled as she held the light steady. The steps looked uneven, carved roughly into dirt and stone, and she could see the faint shimmer of water pooled at the bottom. "It's just a root cellar," she whispered to herself. "Old houses have these." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The cellar wasn't supposed to be here. The blueprints Mrs. Lark had shown her when she first moved in, the ones she'd studied out of curiosity, hadn't mentioned anything under the attic. It made no sense. Julia stood at the opening for a long time before finally lowering one foot onto the first step. The air grew colder instantly, brushing against her skin like a whisper. She descended halfway before stopping. Her flashlight beam trembled over the earthen walls, and then caught on something glinting faintly in the dirt. She crouched, heart hammering, and brushed away the soil. It was a small, rusted object, a silver locket, cracked but still holding its shape. Inside was a photograph so faded it was barely visible, but she could just make out the outline of a boy's face. Beneath it, scratched into the metal, were two initials. T. In the air seemed to shift again, that same slow, invisible exhale. And from below, where the dark met the last edge of her light, came a soft sound, a dragging step, like a foot sliding through wet soil. Julia's light flickered. She scrambled backward, up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut above her. The floor shuddered once, as if something below had struck it from underneath. She sat there shaking, clutching the locket to her chest, listening as the rain outside began again, harder this time, as though trying to bury the sound of whatever was moving beneath her. The storm lingered over the town for 2 more days, its gray clouds heavy and unbroken. Julia spent most of that time alone in the attic, staring at the silver locket she had found beneath the floor. It sat on her desk beside her laptop, its cracked surface catching the faint light that seeped through the rain-soaked window. Every time she opened it, the faded image of the boy seemed to shift, sometimes clearer, sometimes nearly erased, as if the water stains and scratches rearranged themselves each time she blinked. She couldn't shake the feeling that the locket wanted to be understood. By the third morning, she worked up the courage to show it to Mrs. Lark. The old woman was sitting in her parlor, knitting quietly as rain drummed against the windows. When Julia placed the locket on the table, Mrs. Lark's needles stopped mid-stitch. Her eyes widened just slightly, then softened with something between recognition and dread. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice low. Julia hesitated. "In the attic, under the floorboards." The old woman sighed, setting her knitting aside. "It belonged to the Marin boy, Thomas. His mother wore it every day after he disappeared. Said it was the only thing that still felt warm in her hands. When she died, it went missing. We thought the storm had taken it too." Julia leaned forward. "What happened to him, really?" Mrs. Lark didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the locket, holding it as if it might crumble. "There were stories," she said slowly, "that Thomas had been hearing things in the walls before he vanished. Said there was someone trapped under the house. His father called it foolishness, said the boy had too much imagination. But one night, during a storm, Thomas told his mother he was going to let the voice out. The rain outside thickened, slapping the glass in bursts. Mrs. Lark's gaze drifted to the window. They found the attic door open, the window shattered. Only his boots were left behind. The rest of him was gone. That night, Julia couldn't focus on her notes. The locket seemed to hum faintly whenever she touched it, a vibration that ran up her arm like static. She told herself it was her nerves, that her mind was starting to fill in what it didn't understand. But when she laid it beside her bed and turned off the light, she could swear she heard something beneath the sound of rain, a faint voice, the same one she'd heard from under the floorboards. Cold, please. Julia sat up, heart hammering. The locket on her nightstand was open. Slowly, she reached for it and froze. The photo inside had changed. The boy's face was still there, but behind him, barely visible in the blurred background, stood another figure. A man, tall, with his head slightly tilted toward the boy's shoulder. She snapped the locket shut and stumbled back, nearly knocking over her lamp. Her reflection in the dark window stared back at her, pale, trembling, and behind that reflection, for just an instant, she saw movement. The faint silhouette of someone standing at the foot of her bed. Lightning flashed, and the figure was gone. Julia fell against the wall, breathing hard, clutching the locket so tightly it bit into her skin. From somewhere deep in the floor, the house seemed to groan, a long, aching sound that felt less like the shifting of wood and more like a warning. The rain returned that evening, thin and steady, threading down the inn's windows like strands of glass. Evelyn sat at her usual table near the fire, a book open in front of her, but unread. The innkeeper was somewhere in the back, and the common room was otherwise empty, until the door opened. A gust of damp air swept in, carrying the scent of wet stone, and the man in the dark coat stepped inside. He shook the rain from his shoulders, scanning the room until his gaze settled on her. Without asking, he crossed to her table and took the seat opposite her. "You went to the Bend," he said, his voice low, as though they were the only two people in the world. Evelyn's breath caught, but she managed a calm reply. "I did." He studied her for a long moment, his pale gray eyes unreadable. "Then you've seen something." It wasn't a question. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I saw you," she admitted. A faint smile touched his lips, just enough to be noticed. "The river's selective," he said. "It doesn't show people unless there's a reason. And if it shows two people to each other," he let the thought trail off, as though the rest was obvious. Evelyn leaned back slightly, feeling both drawn in and wary. "And what reason would that be?" she asked. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like recognition, or perhaps caution. "It means something is coming," he said finally. "Something that ties us both to this place. The river remembers what was, and it waits for what will be. But it doesn't tell us which is which." Before she could press him further, the innkeeper emerged from the back room, carrying a tray. His eyes flicked to the stranger, and for a moment the room felt taut, as if an invisible thread had been pulled tight. "You'll be wanting a room," the innkeeper said, his voice neutral. The man nodded once, then rose from the table. As he passed Evelyn, he murmured just loud enough for her to hear. "When it begins, you'll know. And you'll wish you hadn't asked." Then he was gone up the stairs, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and something older, harder to name. Morning arrived, but it felt like the storm hadn't ended, only paused to breathe. The sky hung low and bruised, and the air inside the attic was damp and cold. Julia sat in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the window where she had seen the man. The glass was fogged and streaked, but faintly, almost like an echo, she could still see the outline of a handprint pressed against it. No one else was home. Mrs. Lark's door downstairs was closed, her voice absent. The house felt heavier than it had ever been, filled with the quiet pulse of memory. Julia turned the locket over in her hands again and again. Beneath the crack, she noticed something she hadn't before, an inscription along the edge, worn nearly smooth by time. She tilted it toward the light, tracing the words with her fingertip. He waits where the rain cannot reach. The phrase sent a shiver through her. What did it mean? The boy, Thomas, had been lost during a storm. The man, the thing she'd seen outside, only appeared when the rain fell. And that voice, "Don't let him in," had begged for protection from the rain itself. Maybe the storm wasn't just weather. Maybe it was how he traveled. Julia pulled out her recorder and began speaking, her voice shaky but determined. If this is a residual haunting, the entity may be tied to water, to the sound or sensation of rain. Each event has coincided with a storm. The locket may serve as a link, an emotional anchor. She paused, pressing her palm to the floor. Or a warning. As if in answer, a faint rumble rolled through the sky, and the first drops of rain began again, tapping against the roof like fingertips. The sound seemed to sync with her heartbeat. She stood and went to the window. Beyond the blur of rain, the yard below looked strange. The puddles shimmered differently, reflecting shapes that didn't quite match what was above them. In one, she saw the reflection of the attic window, but in it stood a man. Inside, the space was empty. Julia ran downstairs, her bare feet slapping against the wet wood. The hallway light flickered as she reached the photograph on the wall. Her breath caught. The tall figure had returned, but this time, it wasn't standing beside the attic window. It was standing behind the Marin family, inside the frame of their porch, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. And behind him, at the far edge of the image, was something new, a faint blur of another figure, a woman with dark hair, half faded by time. Julia stared, cold realization creeping into her chest. The woman looked like her. The rain intensified, slamming the windows in waves. She turned toward the sound of creaking wood, the front door trembling under some unseen pressure. He waits where the rain cannot reach, she whispered. She understood now. The man wasn't part of the Marins. He was older, bound to the storm itself, seeking new ground when the water fell. And somehow, through the locket, through her presence, he'd found her. She stepped back as the house groaned, the wind pushing harder, the sound of footsteps approaching from the attic above. Not slow this time. Running. The door to the stairwell burst open with a crash, wind and rain exploding into the hall though no window had broken. Julia shielded her face, stumbling backward as the rain itself seemed to shimmer with a faint shape, the same tall figure, walking out of the storm like it belonged to him. His hollow eyes locked on hers, water dripping from his fingertips that never quite touched the floor. The locket grew hot in her hand. The voice, the boy's voice, whispered inside her head, "Don't let him in," but it was too late. The rain had already found its way inside. The storm hit just after midnight, a sound so deep and constant it felt like the world had drowned in it. Wind screamed around the eaves, the gutters overflowed, and water forced its way through every seam in the old wood. Julia had barricaded herself in the parlor with a flashlight, the locket pressed tight in her palm. Every light in the house had gone out. Rainwater streamed through the cracks beneath the door, spreading across the floor in thin, shining veins. The house moaned with every gust, as though something inside it wanted to get free. Upstairs, the footsteps began again. Slow at first, deliberate. They crossed the ceiling directly above her head, paused, then moved toward the attic stairs. Julia gripped the flashlight tighter. "I know who you are," she whispered, half to herself, half to whatever was listening. "You were never after Thomas. You used him." The wind howled louder, rattling the window frames. The house seemed to groan in response, each beam and nail flexing like ribs under pressure. She climbed the stairs, each step slick from the damp, the flashlight's beam trembling across the walls. The hallway photograph swayed on its nail, the glass cracked down the middle. She reached the attic door. It was open. The air that poured from the room was ice cold, sharp with the scent of soil and rot. Inside, water dripped steadily from the ceiling, pooling near the trapdoor. It pulsed faintly, rising and falling as if something below were breathing through it. "Thomas," Julia said softly, stepping closer. "Show me." The locket in her hand vibrated, then burst open, the tiny photograph inside dissolving into water that ran down her wrist. Beneath her feet, The boards shifted, and then the trapdoor began to lift, not from her pulling, but from below. She stumbled back as the door creaked wide, revealing not stairs this time, but a narrow pit filled with standing water. It shimmered with a dim, unnatural light. From its depths rose the faint outline of a boy, pale and translucent, his eyes wide and frightened. "He took me," the boy whispered, his voice echoing through the rafters. He said the rain needed a name. Before Julia could speak, another shape began to form behind him. Tall, shadow-thin, its edges rippling like water disturbed by wind. The man in the rain. His face was clearer now, his features hollowed by centuries of silence. "One leaves, one stays," he said, his voice deep and slow. "The rain remembers balance." His hand reached toward the boy, but the boy shrank away, clutching at the edge of the floor as if trying to climb out. Julia dropped to her knees and reached out her hand. "Take mine," she cried. The boy looked at her, terrified, pleading, and in that instant, she saw it. Not just his face, but hers, reflected faintly in his eyes. Not identical, but similar enough to twist her stomach. She understood then. The connection wasn't random. Her grandmother had been from this town, a woman named Marion Lark. Mrs. Lark wasn't her landlady. She was her great-aunt. This was her family's house. The rain had been calling her back all along. The man's voice turned to a growl, the air vibrating with it. The house breathes what it keeps. The floor shook violently. Water surged upward, flooding across the boards, cold and alive. Julia grabbed the boy's wrist. "You're not staying here," she shouted. The man lunged forward, his form breaking apart into a torrent of rain and shadow. Julia pulled with everything she had, and for a heartbeat, the world split. Light, water, and memory colliding into one blinding instant. The boy screamed. The man howled. The storm outside exploded into silence. When Julia opened her eyes, the attic was still. The trapdoor was closed. The rain had stopped, but the locket, once silver and cracked, now lay open in her palm. The photo inside perfectly clear. It showed the boy smiling beside his family, the tall figure nowhere to be seen. The morning after the dream, Megan woke with the uneasy sensation that her room was smaller than it had been before, the walls just a fraction closer. Her porthole window, usually streaked with spray, was perfectly clean, so clean it reflected her face like a mirror. When she looked into it, for the briefest second, she thought she saw someone standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the cabin was empty. Her unease grew heavier by the hour. She couldn't shake the man's words from the previous day. "You're in my cabin." Determined to learn the truth, she sought out Helen in the library. The older woman's knitting needles clicked rapidly as Megan asked if she knew anything about Cabin 743. Helen hesitated before lowering her voice. "There are stories," she said. "A man died in that room. Some say he jumped from the deck. Others say he never left at all." Megan pressed her for details, but Helen only shook her head. "The crew won't talk about it. Not officially. They scrub the passenger lists every year, but sometimes things slip through." She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "I kept this from a cruise years ago. Same ship. Look at the names." When Megan unfolded the paper, her stomach tightened. It was a photocopy of an old passenger list, dated exactly 3 years prior. Most of the names were blurred from the copy, but one stood out in sharp, bold print. Daniel Crow, Cabin 743. In the column marked Disembarked, his entry was blank. Megan ran her finger down the list twice, hoping she'd missed it, but there was no departure record. When she looked up, Helen's eyes were glassy. "He never checked out," Helen whispered. "And neither did the girl who had that room before you." That night, as the ship rocked gently on the dark water, an announcement blared over the intercom, the kind that instantly quieted every conversation on board. "Attention all passengers. If anyone has seen Ms. Laura Bennett, please contact guest services immediately." Murmurs swept through the hallways. Megan didn't know the name, but her chest tightened anyway. Later, she overheard 2 crew members whispering near the stairwell. "She was last seen near the aft deck," one said. "Security says the cameras glitched again." The other just muttered, "It's happening again." Before walking off quickly, in the early hours of the morning, Megan awoke to the sensation of the mattress shifting, as if someone had just sat down beside her. She kept her eyes closed, paralyzed, every muscle rigid. A moment later, a cold fingertip brushed her wrist, and a man's voice whispered near her ear, "You need to leave."